Does anybody have their video questions? That was all we're waiting. I think some of you may have turned them in yesterday, stuff, which is fine. How'd you do for our first meet?
Good. Well.
Made it over all of them?
Yes.
Yeah. That's good. Let's see. You already turned it in? Okay. Good. Leaving again on Friday, Annalise?
Yep. What spearfish?
Okay, how far is that?
Oh, it's not terrible. I think like maybe 5-hour drive or something like that.
That's not bad.
It's kind of fun. It's where my sister ran track, so she's probably gonna. That's always fun.
And then Rushmore.
Yes. Yep.
What kind of spikes do you like?
I actually have Brooks spikes, which are, it's kind of interesting because they're normally long distance, but I really like them. I got them a couple of years ago now. They're super light.
One of the kids is, going to be doing middle school track, and I'm not sure whether to do spikes or not. We'll see.
Yeah.
So, middle school's kind of interesting because you do lots of different things to kind of figure it out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I had a lot of sock knee spikes throughout high school. Those were pretty good.
How, what's the length for high school or middle school?
I think it's 1/8 of an inch, so you always have to change them out because normally they come with like 1/4 of an inch, but it has to be shorter, so I think it's an 8.
Okay.
At least for Wyoming it was. I'm not quite sure what Montana rules are, but I believe that's
You buy those locally or?
Or most coaches will have them too, most of the time.
Okay. Well, guess enough chit chat, gotta get started, right? So I did collect your video questions, if any of you have those, or you can always submit via email attachment. If you're looking for what questions, it's in the assignments folder on D2L. So just look in there, you'll have access to those links and questions. So wanted to go through what the tentative plan is, and things always evolve as we go through the semester. This is a really busy time of year as we get ready for that final push to the end. So I know you have lots of stuff going on. So I try to plan to let you know as much as possible. So today we will finish chapter 6. Thursday we will have a review of concepts from chapter 5 and chapter 6. So there's a 15-point assignment like we've done in the past, asking you different scenarios on application of chapter 5 and chapter 6 principles. Normally we would have an exam the very next class period, but there's a faculty member in science in this building that really would like to come and learn about biomechanics and what we do here. So she could only come on Tuesday, so we will start chapter 7 on Tuesday, the 29th. We will begin chapter 7, and then next Thursday we'll have the exam over chapters 5 and 6. So I'll have a study guide posted by this Thursday, so you can begin chipping away and preparing for that. So any questions? Questions? Okay. So for those in lab tomorrow, we have a much smaller lab on Thursdays. I would like to meet in the smaller weight room. So the one that's right next to the racquetball court, and that one's not used early in the morning, whereas the big weight room is really crowded early in the morning. So, so lab tomorrow, just plan on just that smaller weight room. We'll test your core for assessment. Next week we have another great assessment. It's for balance. How many have heard of the STAR excursion balance assessment? So we'll do a lab testing that. And so I'll have grids that are set up, and you'll be able to test your single leg reach for each leg and in all 8 directions for the STAR excursion balance test. So we'll just keep the train rolling. Got some good videos here for you a little bit later, but wanted to get back into and finish chapter 6 today. Hey, Logan. So chapter 6 is on angular kinematics. So to review, we have motion from a linear standpoint, both curvilinear and rectilinear. We also have angular motion around an axis. And so the kinematic variables, as we go from displacement, which is a change in position, to velocity, which is the rate of change in position, to acceleration, which is the rate of change in velocity, the units are different for linear motion versus angular motion. So to review, what units do we have to describe a change in angular position? Think of a goniometer that you might use in physical therapy. So degrees would be a unit of change in angular position. We also have radians, and we also have revolutions. So we can convert between those different units. Most often, for application problems, we use radians. So remember, if you're given something in degrees, you'll need to convert it to radians to solve for. It's usually velocity is what you're solving for, but you need to convert the degrees to radians. So rate of change in angular position would be angular velocity. So how fast an object or body is rotating about an axis. And so it would be degrees per second or radians per second. Revolutions per minute is a way of expressing angular velocity. So the movement that we have in our bodies is angular movement. So we have different planes of motion, and our joints rotate about axes that have a 90-degree relationship to the plane of motion. Okay, so lastly, angular acceleration. Okay, so that describes the rate of change in angular velocity. So degrees per second squared, radians per second squared. So it's the same line of reasoning, just different units for linear versus angular motion. So I always, in all of my classes, I really like to focus on the application. So here's a great application. So the frontal plane projection angle, the FPPA, how many have heard of that? Frontal plane projection angle. So the frontal plane describes movement that is side to side motion. So the frontal plane projection angle describes movement of the knee joint side to side as the knee flexes and extends in a weight-bearing stance. So this is a step-down test that maybe some of you future PTs or ATs you'll be doing at certain points to assess frontal plane motion of the knee joint. And so you can see with this step-down test, the knee tends to collapse inward on the weight-bearing side. And last semester in kinesiology, we talked about that and problems associated with that. Do you remember what the weakness might be with this type of valgus knee position? And so what happens is the pelvis tends to drop towards the side of the non-weight-bearing leg. So in this case, the pelvis drops to the right in the frontal plane, so the pelvis is kind of doing this. It's tilting this way. So this is called Trendelenburg sign, and it's usually caused by a weakness in the lateral pelvic muscles, specifically the gluteus medius. So the gluteus medius, this is really a sensitive board. You go this way. Okay, so I'll try not to get too close. But the gluteus medius pulls down on the pelvis on the left side, or the side opposite the non-weight-bearing foot. And so if there's weakness in the gluteus medius, so it's not maintaining pelvic position, then it's going to stretch, and then the pelvis will drop towards the non-weight-bearing side. So the gluteus medius on the contralateral side, on the weight-bearing side, has to maintain tension in keeping the pelvis in a nice level position. So if the pelvis is level, then we have nice alignment between the hip, knee, and an ankle joint without this, the knee collapsing inward like you see here. So what are the clinical implications? Increased frontal plane projection angle is associated with patellofemoral pain. So that's oftentimes caused by wearing down of cartilage on the posterior surface of the patella, and is also oftentimes associated with really dominant quadriceps. So the quadriceps are really strong, and then we say the posterior chain muscles like the hamstrings and gluteus maximus, and of course the gluteus medius are all not getting sufficiently activated. So the quadriceps are kind of dominant, which takes over, and that can cause dysfunction at the knee joint. So you have this wearing down of cartilage at the knee joint. So there's all kinds of corrective things that we can do. As I'm sure that all of you have seen, can you give me some pointers on how we can correct this kind of stuff? Yeah, glute activation. So especially lateral glute activation. So how many have done clam exercise? You got your knees bent and you have a band, and then you're opening the legs up to activate the gluteus medius there. So this is an example there. Okay, so other applications of angles. So this chapter is all about angles. So as we look at muscle development, and in some cases creating greater muscle balance, the same joint action as in shoulder flexion can be done lots of different ways. So the same joint action doesn't necessarily have the same activation pattern for muscles. As we were studying in chapter 5 with the good morning exercise and the parallel back extension, do you remember the greatest torque for the hip joint was produced at different hip angles. So even though it's hip flexion and hip extension, the torque produced at the joint can be different. And so the way that the nervous system activates those muscles is also different. So this is one example of shoulder flexion, and it's an awesome exercise because we have the ability to supinate and pronate and to keep our hands in a neutral position. So that can produce slightly different activation patterns. Training the posterior muscles of the shoulder as well as scapular retractors is really important to prevent shoulder injuries and create greater muscle balance. So sometimes we see the anterior shoulder muscles are really strong, and then we have a lot of weakness back here. So we need to train those actions that pull our shoulders back. So as you can see in this case, when the arms or the shoulders, when the shoulders are flexed 180 degrees, that's where we get the greatest resistance. And with free weights, it's not difficult to determine the direction of resistance, because with free weights, it's always straight down, no matter what. Free weights always provide vertical resistance. And so one of the nice things about cables is we can redirect the force of gravity. So force of gravity is always vertical, but with cables we can redirect that gravitational force to be at different angles. So in this case, the angle of resistance is not straight down, it's more inward there. And it's still shoulder flexion, but the shoulders are being activated a different way because of the different angle of resistance. So I love different angles because that's how we can promote better shoulder health is through different activation patterns. Okay, so angular velocity is the rate of change in angular position. So we have to know what angular position is, and we have to know the time that a change in angular position takes place. So the equation, we get into a lot of Greek symbols here. So the author of this textbook seems to really like those Greek symbols, so you'll have to learn to like them too. So this is the omega, and then you have your theta here representing the angle position. So angular velocity is represented here by the omega symbol. So you have a final angular position, and you have an initial angular position. And so the difference represents the angular displacement divided by the time. And so the outcome of that is can be radians per second or degrees per second, depending on how you're defining your angular position. So we'll go over some application problems, of course, that you'll have practice with that. So this is important in sports because the instantaneous angular velocity when the bat makes contact with the ball will determine how far the ball goes. So velocity of the ball off the bat is dependent on this instantaneous angular velocity at ball contact. So instantaneous is different than average because instantaneous is at the instant of ball contact. So whereas other applications would involve a greater time interval where we would take more of an average measure of angular velocity. So in contrast to instantaneous angular velocity, average angular velocity over greater time periods determines how many times a gymnast will complete twists or somersaults, or a diver before entering the water. So you have to have a sufficient average angular velocity to get all the way through the rotations as part of that skill. Okay, So here's your opportunity. So just as we usually do, look at Sydney. She's got a sheet already. Thank you. So let's do some practice. Mirai Nagasu, I'm going to say, performs a triple twisting jump. So how many is triple? 3. So how many of you can jump up in the air and go around 3 times before coming back down on the ground? I think maybe I could do a 1.5. I'm not going to try it. I'll probably wipe out. She rotates around her longitudinal axis for 3 complete revolutions while in the air. The time it takes to complete the jump from takeoff to landing is 0.8 seconds. That's fast. 3 complete revolutions in less than a second. What is Mirai's average angular speed during the jump? So let's start with the question. What's the difference between speed and velocity? So velocity is a vector, right? Speed is not. Velocity is displacement over time. Speed is distance over time. So if we were to use velocity, why would that be a problem? What would her displacement be if she's going around 3 times and stopping where she started? It'd be 0. So we have to go with the total amount of rotation, which is the distance. Oh, yes. Got my bag and pulled out a tire gauge rather than a penny. All right. So go with degrees per second on this one for your average angular speed. So if you're on the correct path, you probably multiplied 360 degrees by 3. That's a lot of degrees. What'd you get? 1080. Do a 1080. That's pretty awesome if you can do a 1080. And you divide that by 0.8 seconds, and then what's the degrees per second? 1,350 degrees per second is the rate of rotation, rate of change in angular position. So pretty amazing. I would assume that there's a relationship between how fast you're going at takeoff, so your linear skating speed, and your ability to complete those rotations. So all of that energy that you generate in the approach would then have to be transferred into the spin to get around 3 times. So it's fun part of that sport to watch. Okay, so there's a transfer between the angular motion and momentum that we generate through our bodies and the linear velocity. When we release a ball, or when we hit a ball, or throw a ball. So angular motion across joints, that's the wind-up. So we're building angular momentum through the kinetic chain, all the way from the ground, up through the legs, across the torso, into the throwing arm, that is ultimately transferred into linear motion when the ball is released or when the ball is hit. So our ability to efficiently transfer energy through our bodies ultimately determines how fast we throw or how fast the ball will come off the bat. Okay, so in several sports we use implements, and so implements are an extension of our limbs. So we can think of it that way. The implements are an extension of our limbs. And what we know is that if there's a greater radius from the axis of rotation, we're going to impart greater linear velocity. So the implement extends the radius, which increases the distance that a point on an object or body will travel in a given period of time. And so points that are further from the axis will be traveling faster from a linear standpoint. So it's the change in the radius that enables greater velocity. This is one of the most important equations from this chapter because it describes this relationship in transferring angular to linear motion. So if you consider the golf swing, and you consider that the longest clubs are the drivers, and that has to do with being able to impart linear velocity on ball impact. So if we look, V subscript T is tangential linear velocity. The omega symbol here represents angular velocity. So that's how fast the club is rotating during the swing. How fast the swing speed is. What is the swing speed? Club head speed, we could say. The radius is from the club head to the axis. The axis is usually within our bodies. So we could, an easy way to think of the axis would be our core. That's kind of a popular buzzword, core. So the core is the axis within our bodies. So the distance from our core, our axis to the club head represents the radius. So we can see that for a given angular velocity, the relationship between the radius or the club length and the linear velocity is proportional. So if we can swing a longer club with the same angular velocity, that automatically increases linear velocity. And so the ball should go further, assuming that we hit the ball square and on the sweet spot. Okay. So as we go to points further from the axis of rotation, the linear velocity increases as well. So just something that I pulled off the web here, club head angular velocity. So looking at an amateur, all the way PGA Tour average, okay, some professional golfers, top long drive average. Those are kind of fun to watch, those long drive competitions, those great big guys coming out. Of course, a lot of the long drive guys aren't like the big muscular guys. It's more of the guy that can put together an efficient kinetic chain that can hit the furthest. So club head speed, you can see the relationship here. So how many of you have had stats, and I know a few of you have, correlation and relationship. So you can see the club head speed and the average distance. So look at that table all the way down, club head speed and average distance. So what kind of a correlation would that be? Just looking at those, what kind of a correlation would we get, positive or negative? Yeah, we would get positive, and it would probably be a pretty strong correlation. I haven't actually, maybe some of you could go into Excel and actually put in these numbers and figure out what that would be, but it would probably be greater than 0.7, which is a pretty strong correlation between club head speed and average distance. Okay, so let's go with practice problem number 3. We have an awesome hammer thrower here. And this is one where you do need to convert degrees per second to radians per second. So you might be trying to remember how we do that. There are 57.3 degrees per radian. So if you have a degrees per second, you just divide that by 57.3 to get the radians per second. What is the linear velocity? So we're looking for the tangential linear velocity of the hammerhead upon release. So we have an angular velocity, and you should have converted 1300 degrees per second to radians per second. And you can multiply that by the radius. So that would be from the axis, which is actually in the, we could say, the core region, all the way extending out to where the hammer is held. Okay. Now, what are the units for linear velocity? It's not radians per second. How do we express linear velocity? Meters per second. So it's not important that you understand the derivation of radians per second to meters per second. Just know that if you multiply angular velocity by the radius, it comes out to be linear velocity, which is meters per second. So I don't want to go into how we go from radians to meters, but just know that what you're solving for is meters per second. So what'd you get? Yeah, 27.22 meters per second. If you know you're solving for VT, it's going to be meters per second. So which is about 60 miles per hour is how fast the hammer would be going at the point of release. 60 miles per hour, about 27 meters per second. Okay, so applying the relationship between linear and angular velocity. So we know that if a point on a rotating body or object is further from the axis, we know that it's going to have a higher linear velocity. The key is keeping angular velocity the same. So let's take a scenario. If a batter can swing a longer bat with the same angular velocity as a shorter one, that's going to produce a faster linear velocity. The problem with that has to do with mass. So a longer bat should have a higher mass, shouldn't it? Okay, which makes it, that makes the bat more difficult to swing, right? Because it has a higher inertia. So if a longer bat can be designed that's also lighter at the same time, so if you have a combination of a light and longer, so you can maintain angular velocity, then the linear velocity is going to be faster. And so all other factors being equal, if you hit the ball square and on the right spot, the ball's going to go farther. So the same principle could be applied here. Gripping a tennis racket further down the handle increases the linear distance of the swing. So a point further from the axis of rotation between where you hit the ball and where the axis of your joint where you're swinging it is going to increase the linear velocity of the swing on ball contact. Okay, So Logan got another baseball one for you here. So let's read through this together. So a baseball pitcher pitches a fastball with a horizontal velocity of 40 meters per second. So that's about 90 miles per hour. The horizontal displacement from the point of release to home plate is 17.5 meters. The batter decides to swing the bat at 0.30 seconds after the ball was released by the pitcher. The angular velocity of the bat is 12 radians per second. So again, we're swinging. That means how fast we're swinging has to be expressed in angular units. The angular displacement of the bat from the batter's shoulder to the hitting zone above the home plate is 1.5 radians at the back of the plate. Jeez. Let's go this way. Sorry about that. All right. So, and 1.8 radians at the front of the plate. That's a lot of information. So we'll break it down. So, will the bat be in a hitting position above the plate at the same time the ball is above the plate? So we're assuming the pitch is in the strike zone. Okay, so I want you to make two columns on your paper. I want you to make one for the ball, one column for the ball, and one column for the bat. So the idea is to figure out if the ball and the bat are over the plate at the same time. So for the ball, is that linear or angular motion as the ball is traveling towards the plate? With the units, it's linear. So our equation for linear velocity, velocity is equal to what divided by what? Marshall? I see your lips moving. Displacement divided by time is what you said, yeah. Okay, so we can also rearrange that equation to be time is equal to displacement divided by velocity. Time is equal to displacement divided by velocity. So all I did is rearrange the velocity is equal to displacement divided by time. Now we're saying time is equal to displacement divided by velocity. So write that down. Time is equal to displacement divided by velocity. So that's the first thing. We're going to solve for how much time it takes the ball to go from release to the plate. So I want you to solve for 17.5 meters is the displacement divided by a velocity of 40 meters per second gives you the time from release to, okay, so let's extend all the way out. So we're talking about fractions of a second. So 0.4375 seconds. So that's incredibly hard. One of the hardest things to do in sports is to hit a 90 mile per hour plus fastball, 0.4375 seconds to react. So that's the ball. Okay, so now we're going to go over and look at the bat. Okay, so what's the decision time? So the ball is on its way, and what fraction of that 0.4375 does the batter decide to swing? 0.3. So I want you to write decision time equals 0.3 seconds. Okay, so now we got to figure out, given that the batter is swinging the bat this fast, 12 radians per second, and we have two different displacements here. So from the batters, wherever they're holding the bat, from where they initiate the swing, to the back of the plate is 1.5 radians. So remember, angular velocity is equal to angular displacement divided by time. So what we want is time. So we can say time is equal to displacement of 1.5 radians divided by the swing speed, which is what? Remember? 12 radians per second to get the time to the back of the plate. So figure that out. So 1.5 radians divided by 12. Okay, so write that down. So to the back of the plate is 0.125. Okay, and then given that swing speed to the front of the plate, what's our time? So 1.8 radians divided by 12 radians per second. What is our time in that case? Yeah, 0.15. Okay, so we've got 0.125 to get to the back of the plate, 0.15 to get to the front of the plate. Okay, so given that it took 0.3 seconds for the batter to decide to swing, you're going to add 0.3 to, what was our time to the back of the plate? Okay, so you're going to add 0.3 and 0.125 together. And what do you get there? Yeah, 0.425. Now you're also going to add 0.3 to 0.15. So the time to decide the swing, and then the time of the swing to the front of the plate. 0.3 plus 0.15 gives you what? 0.45. Okay, so I want you to compare that with where the ball's going to be. What was the time for the ball? 0.4375. The time for the bat to the back of the plate is 0.425. The time for the bat to the front of the plate is 0.45. So will the bat be in a hitting position above the plate at the same time as the ball? The answer is yes. Yes, it will. Yes, it will. So those times are within the same range. Any questions on that one? So we're just looking at the time for two different things here and trying to match them up. Okay, so angular acceleration. So we went over angular displacement, went over angular velocity. Now we're to the very last one, so the very end of the chapter on angular acceleration. So just like linear acceleration, angular acceleration is a change in angular velocity. So units are radians per second squared or degrees per second squared. Either way, so remember it's not meters per second, radians or degrees per second squared. Okay, so what we have, the formula is the Greek alpha is equal to the final angular velocity minus the initial angular velocity divided by the time. So practically speaking, an object or body that is rotating at a constant rate will have what angular acceleration? 0, because it's maintaining a constant rate of spin. So if something goes from rest or from a constant rate of spin to a faster or slower rate of spin, then we would have angular acceleration. Another important point is we also defined acceleration as a change of direction. So an object or body could be spinning at a constant rate, and although angular acceleration would be 0, linear acceleration would not be 0 because we also defined linear acceleration as a change in direction. And an object or body that is rotating is constantly changing direction, isn't it? At every instant, it's oriented slightly different. Okay, so before we get into the relationship between linear and angular acceleration, let's, I think we've got 2 more practice problems. So let's do this one just for practice with angular acceleration for a golf swing. So you're given a initial angular velocity, given a final angular velocity, and you're given a time from the top of the backswing to the bottom of the downswing. And you're given the radius. So there's a couple of things to solve for here. So your angular acceleration should be in radians per second squared. For the first question, anybody have that one already done? Radians per second. What is the angular acceleration of the club? So you got 20 radians per second minus 0 radians per second divided by the time, which is 0.2. So radians per second squared. Who would be courageous enough to throw out an answer for that? Is it 100? 100 radians per second squared? Everybody agree? I didn't work this out before class, so relying on you for this. Okay, so what is the linear velocity? So we could say tangential linear velocity. So what's that equation that we have that describes the transfer of angular motion to linear motion? So V subscript t is equal to angular velocity times the radius. So you take your angular velocity, which is, Logan said, 100. Oh, wait, no, angular velocity, not angular acceleration. I'm sorry, Logan. Angular velocity at the bottom of the downswing is 20 radians per second. So we're looking for angular velocity in this second. So my mistake, Logan. So the second equation here, so 20 radians per second multiplied by your radius. And again, just know that you're going to be in meters per second for your answer. What'd you get for meters per second? 40 meters per second, which is around 90 miles per hour at ball contact for that. 40 meters per second. So 20 radians per second multiplied by a radius of 2 meters gives you 40 meters per second. So again, not important that you understand how we go from radians to meters, just know that we do. Okay, so there's a relationship between angular velocity and linear velocity. So for a given angular velocity, as a point on a rotating body or object is further from the axis, the linear velocity is higher. Linear velocity increases. And if the linear velocity is increasing, we have linear acceleration. That's how linear acceleration is defined, as an increase in linear velocity in a given period of time. Okay, so for a rotating body or object, there are 2 components of linear acceleration, 2 parts. An object or body that is undergoing rotation will have 2 components of linear acceleration. The first one is called tangential acceleration. Okay, what does that word tangent mean? Yeah, 90 degrees to the circular path of motion. So this is our equation for tangential or linear acceleration. So the A subscript T stands for instantaneous tangential linear acceleration. Linear acceleration is in meters per second squared. Meters per second squared. The alpha here stands for instantaneous angular acceleration in radians per second squared. And then the R stands for the radius. So as the radius increases, for a given amount of angular acceleration, the linear acceleration also goes up. So linear acceleration and the radius are proportional for a given angular acceleration. So this is a good way to explain it, an old record player, but it works really well to explain this concept. So if we have an axis here and we have progressively further points from the axis, as this object is spinning, okay, at a given instantaneous angular acceleration, points that are further from the axis will have a higher linear acceleration. So that's what these green arrows indicate, is the linear acceleration. That linear acceleration is at what angle? Yeah, it's at a 90-degree angle or tangent to the path of rotation here. So for a given angular acceleration, points that are further from the axis will have a higher linear acceleration. Okay, so tangential linear acceleration is one component of linear acceleration. The other component is centripetal acceleration. How many of you have heard of this concept? Yeah, centripetal. This is the linear acceleration directed towards the axis. Directed towards the axis of rotation. So there's a couple of different ways we can calculate centripetal acceleration. Sometimes centripetal acceleration is called radial acceleration. So that's why you see the little r, subscript r, under the A, is because it's sometimes called radial versus centripetal, just so you know that. So centripetal or radial acceleration, again, it's linear, so it's in meters per second squared. It's the linear acceleration directed towards the axis of rotation. Is equal to, let me see, I got my bullets mixed up here, is equal to the angular velocity squared multiplied by the radius. So that's the first method that we can calculate centripetal or radial acceleration. Angular velocity squared multiplied by the radius. Okay. Second method is angular or centripetal acceleration. Radial acceleration is equal to linear velocity squared, so v subscript t squared, divided by the radius. So tangential linear velocity in meters per second, you take that and you square it, divided by the radius will give you radial or centripetal acceleration. So let me just show you a couple of, this will kind of help solidify things. So you have a rotating object and you have an axis in the middle. So the two components of linear acceleration are the tangential acceleration, as Joe said, 90 degrees to the circular path, and centripetal acceleration, which is directed towards the center. So both of these, tangential and centripetal, are expressed in meters per second squared. So they're linear acceleration, so it's meters per second squared. So something else, centripetal acceleration has a relationship with centripetal force. Centripetal acceleration, centripetal force are proportional. So which of Newton's laws? You can see if you look up here. Remember Newton's second law? This is the angular expression of Newton's second law. So the linear expression of Newton's second law was force is equal to mass times linear acceleration. The angular expression is centripetal force is equal to mass multiplied by centripetal acceleration. Centripetal acceleration. Not linear acceleration, centripetal acceleration. So describing the linear acceleration that's directed towards the center. So for a given mass, as centripetal acceleration goes up, centripetal force also goes up in proportion. So just like Newton's second law from a linear standpoint, from a circular standpoint, there's a proportional relationship between centripetal force and centripetal acceleration. So I want to just show this little bit of a video. It's about the golf swing. This is about 5 minutes. Science of the golf swing.
It's the big drive that leads off almost every hole, the tee shot.
Your number one goal is to move the ball as far as you possibly can in the straightest direction.
I feel I can hit it anywhere with a driver.
Hitting a powerful drive takes more than just strength and coordination. It also requires 3 physics concepts: torque, centripetal force, and something known as the double pendulum effect.
What happens is you can use physics to allow the forces to do the work for you.
To explore the physics of a golf swing, we filmed Paula Creamer, a professional golfer on the LPGA Tour, and amateur golfer Mike Miller with a Phantom camera that captured their drives at 5,000 frames per second.
It's really cool. Really cool.
Known as the Pink Panther because she loves the color pink, Paula Creamer has won 11 tournaments, including the U.S. Women's Open in 2010. Her shots are most notable for their accuracy.
I don't miss many fairways. I don't miss many greens at all. I pretty much swing within myself.
Part of the reason for Creamer's success on the golf course is her ability to master the double pendulum effect. A pendulum is a weight suspended from an anchor from which the weight can pivot or swing freely under the influence of gravity.
If you look simply at a clock, an old grandfather clock that you might have in your living room or your hallway, the thing that goes back and forth is the pendulum. And it's the simplest of linear motion about an arc.
John Spitzer is Managing Director of Equipment Standards at the United States Golf Association. He says that during a drive, there are actually 2 pendulums at play. Creamer's arms make up the first pendulum, which moves or pivots around her anchoring shoulders. Her wrists are the pivot for the second pendulum below it, her golf club.
As that pendulum swings, the one on the bottom swings independently.
If the double pendulum is executed properly, it can make the golf swing feel effortless.
You know instantly if you hit a great one, if you hit it a little thin, a little heavy, a little bit on the toe, a little bit on the heel.
And then when you do connect, absolutely perfect, you know.
As of May 2013, Mike Miller is ranked 9th in the United States in amateur golf. His drives are most notable for their distance.
That's one of the strongest parts of my game is driving.
Miller's swing displays the second physics concept, centripetal force, or a force that makes an object move in a curved motion. Much like a roller coaster speeding around a loop, centripetal force is what keeps the cars turning instead of flying off the track into space. Miller creates centripetal force by anchoring his lower body and pulling his wrists inward, while the golf club swings outward and through the second pendulum.
As you're further away from the center for the rotation, you're getting more speed.
The bigger the circle, the less centripetal force is needed to continue rotating the golf club so that it can move faster and therefore hit the ball farther.
The more you can turn, the more you can get that big arc in your swing, the farther you should be able to hit it.
But the most important factor to a big tee shot is the third physics concept, torque, or force times distance, is a turning force that changes the rate of rotation in an object.
If you look at the swing as a whole, you're looking at torque as the main thing in the actual golfer's swing.
Think of a wrench tightening a bolt. The longer the wrench, the more torque it creates. Both Creamer and Miller apply torque throughout their entire swing by rotating their shoulders during the backswing and then twisting their hips as they bring the club down to strike the ball.
You're rotating as much as you possibly can with your shoulders, and then you're just letting it go with your hips.
The more turning force Creamer and Miller apply to their swings, the faster and more powerful their drives will be.
I was able to notice that how much torque I'm creating. I never really thought about it until you really see it in slow-mo with the fan camera, and it's really cool.
Torque, centripetal force, and the double pendulum effect, the key concepts in the physics of a golf swing.
So one of the key points from that, if you remember, is we go back here, they said the bigger the circle, the less centripetal force needed to keep the club moving. So let's look mathematically at how that works. So this equation right here, centripetal force is equal to the mass of the club multiplied by centripetal acceleration. So the size of the circle, the size of the swing circle could be represented by the radius. Okay, so if we have an increased radius, so as the size of the circle increases, like what they were showing on the video, as the size of the circle increases in the denominator here, so we have an increased radius, the size of the circle increases, what does that do to centripetal force? Like they were saying, yeah, so mathematically the centripetal force is less, so there's less effort required to keep the club moving in that circle with a larger radius, or if the club is longer, which would contribute to that circle. Okay, so here's another application with softball, fast pitch softball. So in this case, what we see is we can say the radius would be represented by arm length. So the distance from the shoulder to where the ball is being held out here. So in this case, a longer arm would create greater centripetal acceleration. So this would be the appropriate equation to apply in this case. So if we have greater centripetal acceleration, that means greater angular velocity, okay, which means that the ball is going to be released faster. So I have one more video for you here about that concept.
It's all about myths and legends on this episode of Sports Science. hardest thing to do in sports. Is that true? We found someone who wants to put that myth to the test. Meet Jenny Fish. Jenny is a 6-foot-tall Olympic gold medalist and NCAA Pitcher of the Year. She believes that hitting a softball is harder than hitting a baseball and is here in our lab to prove it. To start, we wanted to compare the force with which a baseball and a softball arrive at home plate. The harder it hits, the harder it is to hit.
And we have our strike force plate behind here to actually measure the load or the force that the ball generates when it impacts. Basically, all you have to do is have the pitch break through these two beams and hit that plate, and we'll be able to collect the force that's generated.
First up, baseball. Cal State Fullerton flamethrower Adam Jorgensen will see how much force his 95-mile-per-hour fastball creates. The 95-mile-per-hour fastball generates 2,411 pounds of force when it hits the strike force plate. Now, let's see if the softball generates more or less force than the baseball. Jenny's pitches will provide unprecedented data, so we can determine once and for all which contains more force, baseball or softball.
You just broke it. But
Coming in, they told me that I was gonna throw it in some scientific air, and my goal was to come in here and break it. And that's what we did.
Jorgensen's missiles generated an impressive 2,411 pounds of force. Jenny's first pitch broke the machine. We're going to give round one to Jenny. With their high-tech equipment smashed to bits, we decided to test baseball versus softball by bringing in a live research subject, Arizona Diamondbacks prospect Brian Byrne. Brian hit .310 last season in the minor leagues. First, he's going to face our baseball flamethrower. Brian has no problem hitting 95 miles per hour baseball pitches. He's a pro. Now it's Jenny's turn, and Brian has to hit off a pitcher like none he's ever faced, and from a lot closer. Let's just hope she goes easier on him than she did on our gear. Brian's struggles are no surprise. A baseball hitter facing a pitcher standing 60 feet 6 inches away and throwing 95 miles per hour has only 395 milliseconds to react to the ball. Jenny, standing only 43 feet away and throwing 70 miles per hour, allows the hitter only 350 milliseconds to react. So a softball batter has less time to react. And that's not the only disadvantage.
We did a lot of studies on what makes it difficult to hit a pitcher, and one of the things that makes it difficult is the visual. Baseball hitters typically are used to seeing a pitch come from a certain area, so unless they've seen a lot of pitchers that come from down under, they're gonna have a difficult time with that.
Our Vicon House and Moves motion capture technology allows us to
We're
break
getting one of
down the
these in our
pitch
lab
motion of Jenny
over the
Finch
summer.
in order to illustrate exactly why it's more difficult to hit a softball than a baseball. This is not a computer simulation. This is Jenny's actual pitch. The softball pitch may look casual, but it packs a punch. Jenny's shoulder is a fulcrum, and her arm a 3-foot-long lever. With massive rotational inertia, she rockets the ball over 70 miles per hour. The baseball's falling high to low path makes a last instant swing adjustment easier. Because of gravity, a batter can quickly drop his hands and hit a descending ball. For softball, the low to high trajectory makes adjustment difficult. It's much harder for a batter to raise his hands than it is to drop them, making a rising softball pitch a unique challenge.
What did you think?
It's just different. A lot different. It's tough. It's tough.
What's the biggest single difference?
I think it's just the angle and getting some balls that rise.
To admit that hitting a baseball is the hardest thing to do in all of sports? Shattered. Coming up.
All right, so a longer arm, like she has, means greater centripetal acceleration, which means faster linear velocity on release. So we're almost done, very last slide. So the next practice problem. So track athletes. Is it more difficult? Does it require more exertion running on the inside lane or the outside lane at a given moment? Okay, yes, you may go further. Okay. Inside has tighter turns, which is all about centripetal acceleration. So if we know centripetal acceleration is equal to linear velocity divided by the radius, a tighter turn means less radius, right? Less radius. So if we have less radius, what does that do to centripetal acceleration? Centripetal acceleration goes up as the turn radius goes down. So a higher centripetal acceleration means it's placed a lot more exertion between the soles of our feet and the track. So the frictional force that we would have to exert to maintain our path around the track would be a lot higher due to the tighter radius. So last practice problem, John runs around the curve of a track in lane 1, while Wade runs around the curve in lane 8. The radius of lane 8, Wade, is twice the radius of John in lane 1. If John must run 50 meters to get fully around the curve in lane 1, how far does Wade have to run to get fully around the curve in lane 8? And then a next question, why would it require more exertion to run on the inside lane? So what we'll use is our linear distance equals our angular position multiplied by the radius. Okay? And so we can rearrange this equation to be angular position is equal to our linear distance divided by the radius. Okay, so in this case, the radius for Wade, is twice the radius for John. Radius for Wade is twice the radius is for John. So that's given to us in the problem here. So what we can do is set this up, set them equal to each other. The linear distance for John divided by the radius for John equals the linear distance for Wade divided by the radius for Wade, which we know is twice what it is for for John. And so if we set this up, we can say John travels a distance of 50 meters for his radius, and we can solve for the linear distance that Wade travels, knowing that his radius is twice what it is for John. So what we're solving for is right here, the linear distance that Wade has to travel in lane 8. So how would you solve this equation right here for linear distance of Wade? What would you do to get this all by itself? You can multiply both sides of the equation by 2, right? Okay. So then the radius cancels out. What are you left with for the linear distance of Wade? 2 times 50 is 100. 100 meters is correct on that one. So we're just solving for the linear distance here. Multiplying each side by 2, radius cancels, and we have 100 meters for the outside lane versus the inside lane. So the next question, just to review again, we talked about this just a few minutes ago, is centripetal or radial acceleration is equal to linear velocity squared divided by the radius. So with a tighter radius, okay, so running on the inside lane would be a much shorter radius in the denominator means there's a greater amount of centripetal acceleration. So that's the reason it requires more exertion, more frictional forces between our track and the feet to keep our bodies traveling around the track with a shorter radius. Any questions on that? Okay. So that's all I have for today. So please just let me have your practice problem sheets. For Thursday, we'll do a review of concepts, chapter 5 and chapter 6. Thank you.